Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin, and I am coming at you, I don't want to say live, it's a pre-recorded show, but in this moment where I'm saying this into the can, I'm coming at you live from the city of Moscow, the capital of the Third Rome. I am back. I'm here for an interesting conference, so be sure to follow me on all the socials to see how that is going, but I'm not going to let that stop me from bringing you the news this week and talking about World War Now. Of course, there's no Ether Hour this week, so to all the supporters, I apologize, but we should have a new Q&A thread going up soon for supporters for our next Q&A, and we're going to have a big episode with some guests coming out pretty soon behind the paywall as well. So don't lose hope. The content is coming for you. But all that being said, this is a huge week in World War Now. Some of these stories are, it's almost as if we made the news happen this week. So Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad, and it's good to hear from you from the Third Rome itself. And yes, absolutely. We're looking forward to that thread coming up in order to hear all of your input, guys, all the great discussion questions, which, of course, we look forward to covering maybe in a week or a week and a half or so upon your return from Moscow. But the news is quite varied. It's obviously not as explosive as last week. I think many news won't be as passionate as the episode covering last week. But this week, definitely some really, I guess, we can see the fallout after the fall of Avdiivka itself in Russia. This is most importantly coming from Western media sources, a lot of people crying, a lot of people upset. The death of Navalny has caused an uproar, right? In Western media, they've essentially used it to cover up any sort of Russian successes in the Donetsk Oblast, claiming that Putin is a murderer, essentially claiming things which essentially aren't substantiated at all, and notice it's just the same as with the COVID story, right? When the COVID pandemic hit, they all began claiming that the COVID vaccine was the only solution. All the countries are like a one united head. They're all like the heads of the Hydra began speaking about this one particular issue with having one solution here as well. It's like Navalny has died. The Russian successes in Avdiivka do not matter because internally Russia is destabilized. But as you can see, Conrad, you're in Russia right now, and in fact, the country is not just stabilized, it's incredibly civil and beautiful, and things are taken care of. And essentially something that has taken place somewhere on the North Pole, right, which probably has something to do with external forces interfering, as we've seen from the news, essentially from Ukraine itself. Ukraine has somehow received footage from the actual prison of Navalny. I'm not sure how Ukrainian journalists have received it. Probably either CIA, MI6, SBU spies have somehow made themselves, either purchased this footage or made themselves, somehow integrated themselves through, maybe from the 90s, maybe some sleeper cell agents were active in Russia this entire time since the Yeltsin years. But nevertheless, this story kind of, in the West at least, paints a dark sort of pattern over Russia and its recent successes. But for those in Donetsk, Avdiivka, the victory is seen as like a ray of hope, a ray of light, especially in light of all the bombardment that's been happening recently. And Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, actually arriving in Avdiivka wearing a helmet supported by guards, looking at the surroundings. There's some great churches still standing in that particular town. Most importantly, the Cathedral of St. Mary Magdalene has been visited by a lot of the Russian forces. It was right next to the bombardment zone, and miraculously, this church in Avdiivka has survived. Neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians have actually struck it. And yes, it has been hit by some small shrapnel. You can see some pieces of the roof have been damaged, but inside the church itself, it's basically just dusty, and it can be refurbished quite quickly. It's just small miracles like this, I think, uplift the spirits of not just the Russian people, but also the local Ukrainians who have now become Russian citizens. And look, they're not being persecuted. They can still worship the one true God. And of course, our Lord Jesus Christ looks mercifully upon those who actually fight with Christ in their hearts. And I think that's the most important message, is that Avdiivka was freed by Russian Orthodox soldiers. And in fact, this Orthodox Christian religion actually unites all the people living in Ukraine and Russia, regardless of what they identify themselves as, whether they identify themselves as Ukrainian or Russian going forward.
Yeah, Avdiivka, we've seen some interviews and videos of people that were in their houses during the entirety of this battle. The fact that anybody remained there is actually insane to me, but many of them, of course, have said that they were just waiting for years and years, decades even, for some of them, for Russia to finally show up, and now they're there. So another liberation has occurred, and of course, a story that is going to be probably one of our main openers here is something that we've talked about since the very beginning of the show, and that is Transnistria, Transnistria. And it's back in the news because, according to Russian, Romanian, all sorts of news outlets, the Transnistrian government is about to call what I believe would be the 6th Congress of the Transnistrian legislature and the government there. And because there's only been 6, you can deduce that those are called when very important things happen in Transnistrian statehood and what's going on in the surrounding areas. And it seems that the rumors are that they will be voting and assessing a plan and establishing a desire to integrate themselves into the Russian Federation. And of course, that would be a dramatic escalation if Russia were to actually support the Transnistrians in that in that endeavor. But of course, we know we love Transnistria, and we love Vadim Krasnoselsky, who is the head of Transnistria, and he himself, despite the fact that Transnistria has hammers and sickles all over its flags, and it's a very Soviet-looking place as far as aesthetics are concerned, he is an avowed monarchist, a lover of the Russian Empire, and so perhaps it's part of why we hope for Pridnestrovian integration, is that might help boost forward, the imperial ideas in Russia and, the love of the Tsar and have more. I mean, he would enter Russian politics. You talk about Denis Pushilin, who was just a Donetsk guy. He was in some of these nationalist circles, and now next thing you know, he's the head of a Russian oblast. And the same thing could happen to Vadim Krasnoselsky and some of these other characters in Transnistria. It is integrated into Russia, and of course, that would help, I think, move the ideas that we would like to see in the Russian Federation forward. But outside of that, this is big news because of the huge ammunition depot that is in Transnistria, and of course, just the extremely relevant location right on the border with Ukraine, next to Moldova, which is basically the other major European non-NATO country at this point that Russia is looking at in its sphere. And of course, this all comes along as Medvedev has called for Odessa to come home. So of course, Transnistria will always become more relevant as Russia continues to creep closer to Odessa.
Yeah, that's right. I think Transnistria, a lot of people actually underestimated its importance to both Ukraine and Moldova. Naturally, it's that buffer state, which if it was integrated into Ukraine or Moldova, or maybe even split into half by these opposing forces, and Transnistrian sovereignty would be, taken aback by the Western-sided Moldovans. Naturally, Moldova would, of course, have an opportunity, legally speaking, to actually enter into NATO, because at the moment, Moldova really, it is a Western-sided state. Its Prime Minister, Maia Sandu, really wishes Moldova to enter into NATO and the EU proper, but it cannot because, again, the statehood, or at least the territory of Moldova, is currently compromised by this existing sliver of a state between Moldova and Ukraine called Transnistria. And naturally, Vadim Krasnoselsky is a giant barrier and like a barricade for Moldova to actually become allied with its I guess, spiritual neighbors in the West. But we should just consider the one most important factor in, I guess, Transnistrian geopolitical importance today, and that's the Kolbasna ammunition depot. So there's a village of Kolbasna located just, I would say, in the northeastern part of Transnistria currently. It's an old Soviet munition depot, which naturally just from the Cold War era, 1940s, 1950s, going back almost to the end of the World War II and the siege of Berlin, which was used by Soviet logistics in order to, push the Third Reich further west. And this particular, it's essentially located in the side of a mountain. It has a lot of underground storage. In terms of actual munitions being stored there at Kolbasna, we're looking at 20 to 30,000 tons of various munitions, from artillery to early fab bombs. A lot of the munitions there are actually made for Soviet-grade weaponry, which, Ukraine still almost half of its military, despite the fact that the West has been supplying Ukraine with a lot of these updated NATO technology, a lot of the Ukrainian military still uses these older iterations of, I guess you can say, Soviet weaponry. And so this munition depot, if kept captured by Ukraine from Transnistria and if taken by Moldova, maybe they can split it in half between Moldova and Ukraine. It could actually really bolster the Ukrainian munition shortage situation, which has been essentially one of the main talking points of the second half of 2023, and Zelensky crying that they simply are running out of munitions and the Russians are overpowering them logistically. And this could perhaps solve that issue, at least for a short duration. So would there be any benefit of Ukraine and Moldova using maybe a pincer strike maneuver on Vadim Krasnoselsky's Transnistria in the near future, especially with this weird referendum type situation that they're having with the Transnistria potentially looking to join Russia at the end of February? So the dates we're looking at here is February 28th and February 29th is when the meeting in Transnistria will take place. And so potentially Ukraine and Moldova may be provoked to actually strike on Transnistria. I think that's the main discussion point. And this Kolbasny ammunition depot, which does have Russian forces stationed there. So, the question arises, Conrad, it's like, well, is Russia going to react? Well, Russia simply can't react. I mean, Russia is not adjacent to Transnistria in any way. Yes, it's an allied state. Transnistria, in order to actually reach it, as we've spoken about on previous episodes, Russia would need to go through the Odessa Oblast, which is quite a large Ukrainian oblast with the great city of Odessa. Ukraine has built it up over the last few years. They are expecting a Russian amphibian type operation. Odessa is one of the main port cities operating on the Black Sea. It's probably one of the largest ports at the moment. So Ukraine is definitely, it's intrigued. It really wants to defend that particular area. So Russia has its work cut out for it. And frankly, those Russian forces, there's only 1,700 or so soldiers stationed in Transnistria belonging to the Russian Federation. They're kind of between a rock and a hard place. How will they will they surrender if the Ukrainian and Moldovan forces strike on Transnistria, to try and take out this rebel Russian Republic, this new sort of Lugansk and Donetsk appearing on the west side of Ukraine, very uncomfortably so for the Ukrainians, because essentially, if all of Ukrainian defenses are facing north and eastwards, suddenly they have to look to the southwestern corner and notice that there is a pro-Russian, this weird separatist type of republic appearing there. And Moldovans look at, of course, Transnistrians as separatists, but Ukrainians just simply will see them as hostile. And, there's that high possibility that we will see some really hot military actions at the end of February here, especially, it is a leap year, so we might get that strange, like, February 29th occasion taking place in the West. Very unfortunately for the people of Transnistria, who they don't have the best economic situation, but they do love God, and there are a lot of churches and monasteries per capita in that particular small country. So looking forward to seeing how Russia can perhaps contribute and maybe save them from any sort of calamities, and maybe even a Ukrainian aggression. Perhaps the diplomatic action could be taken here.
And of course, there's the eternal question of Moldova's accession into NATO, which we know that NATO wants, but Russia obviously wouldn't accept that. And it's one of those things where, while on the one hand, Moldova is currently unable to enter NATO because of the Transnistria conflict, one of the prerequisites of joining is not having ongoing territorial disputes within your territory. So on the one hand, the kind of middle ground of Transnistria right now does help Russia, but I'm wondering as well if this Congress is going forward, if Krasnoselski perhaps picked something up that maybe the Ukrainians or the Moldovans were going to try something in the next few months, and he would rather just go all in now. Of course, we'll never know. Maybe we'll have Krasnoselski on the show someday. That's a dream. But yeah, the Transnistria thing is, again, I think even in our first episode, if not our first few episodes, we were talking about this and how this is going to be something that will ultimately be a lever that either side can use in different directions, whether it's the West wants to launch an attack or whether it's Russia wants to give credence to this upcoming Congress and referendum. It's definitely going to move the conflict forward, to say the least. But before we get on to a few more things regarding the front line and everything, our good friend Milorad Dodik was in Belarus and in Russia. Of course, he met with Lukashenko and with Putin recently. And of course, we've talked to Jim Jatras, who is also, friends with Dodik, and he has been to Srpska many times. And again, Republika Srpska is standing strong against Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Christian Schmidt, the, high representative from Europe and from The Hague and whatnot, and they are standing strong for Serbian sovereignty. And it's good that Dodik is making these connections, because there's a lot of interested parties that would want to see him gone. So it's good that he's got some powerful friends. But Dmitry, what did you think of his meeting with Lukashenko? Because Lukashenko said some pretty interesting things as well.
I think it's quite faded. Look, we speak about Milorad Dodik quite often, and in very fond lights, especially when he's compared to, somebody like Vucic, right, in Serbia. So Milorad Dodik is like the best, I guess, Orthodox version of what a Serbian politician should be like, what a real Serbian leader could be if Serbia, actually had the opportunity to elect a person like that without, electoral interference and things of that capacity. But Dodik naturally visiting the last dictator of Europe is like a big sign, I think, for both Bosnian Muslims as well as liberal Serbs, that look, he's being inspired by, in their eyes, the wrong type of people. And he also, it wasn't just like the secular leader, Lukashenko, who isn't an Orthodox Christian. He doesn't practice as more of like a Soviet agnostic type of guy, but he also visits the main cathedral of Minsk, venerates the Minsk Theotokos, a really famous icon in the Orthodox Church, and probably the most famous icon of all of Belarus. And Dodik, as an Orthodox Christian, meets up and speaks, has a one-on-one meeting with Metropolitan Vitaly, the Exarch of Belarus, and Metropolitan of Minsk, so the most important bishop of that particular region and diocese, right, essentially. He is similar to Metropolitan Onufri of Ukraine, I would say. That would be the correct comparison here. So Dodik essentially knows his audience, and he knows exactly who he's appealing to at home and overseas, and he knows the strengths, right, of this Orthodox unity. And it's not just based around being Slavic. It goes beyond that, and the ties between the Balkan Christian people and the Russians are a lot closer. It's not just the unity of R1b or R1a, genetics, haplogroup, similar culture, but it's the fact that these are the last remnants of Eastern Orthodox Christian civilization, which simply have some sort of sovereignty, or at least have a potential future in world geopolitics. And Dodik understands this, and he's using it as sort of leverage against a new world order. He's leveraging these connections and the opportunities he still has. It's really amazing. And he did meet with Vladimir Putin as well in Moscow. So Dodik is really making a sort of like a 2-for-1 trip here to the eastern states, kind of maybe solidifying his position. And look, he's similar to Krasnoselski. Dodik is this a leader of a small I guess, a small conglomeration of Orthodox Christian Slavs in these Eastern post-Soviet states. You have to consider that he doesn't have much power, and he knows that the eye of Sauron of the NATO and the EU, all these liberals internally as well externally, are watching him, and they're ready to pressure him into action. But he fearlessly goes and meets with essentially the enemies of the West today, the enemies of this New World Order, as Metropolitan Theophilos enlightened us again with this great interview we'll discuss later. Dodik meets with these people, and he openly essentially calls out the masters of, who rule, essentially still rule over Serbia, a large proportion of Serbia, and Greece, as we found out last week. And Dodik essentially calls them out by meeting with these people like Putin and Lukashenko and Metropolitan Vitaly. So I think it's a big sign. It's a very brave sign from him, and going forward, it's one of those inspirations for future Orthodox Christian politicians in these countries that, look, you can actually be an underdog and you can still come out on top bravely and visit some of these people and have private consultations about how to build your future country in a Christian fashion.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And of course, Putin awarded Dodik the Order of Alexander Nevsky Award, which he says it was for his great contribution to the development and cooperation between Russia and Republika Srpska. So, Dodik, he's now a denizen and a warrior for Saint Alexander. So may Saint Alexander Nevsky bless, the people of Serbia and the people of Srpska specifically. And you mentioned how it was a brave thing to do because, of course, he is protected in his place in Srpska. He has people protecting him. He has the support of the Serbian patriarch. But at the same time, he has to deal with this Muslim front. And we've seen how he has, balanced, the Islamic rhetoric around the world and everything. Because at the end of the day, it's tough when your country is Serbia or Montenegro or whatever it is, and your leaders that represent your ethnicity are wanting to get into the EU. Meanwhile, you have these Bosnians and Albanians that are full-on irredentists. They want to make every country that they're in totally Muslim, and there's talk in all these countries, there's communities that want to institute Sharia law. So of course, I think it's brave and very bold of Dodik to be kind of standing athwart, the Muslimization. It sounds like we're back in 2015 again with this kind of rhetoric, but he's still one of those leaders that has to deal with that directly, not in like a mass immigration kind of way, but in a clash of civilizations way, because there is still that Muslim remnant down there in the Balkans and Europe. We didn't get all of them, you know what I mean? So he's got to deal with that. But I think he's in good hands. I think Srpska's in good hands. He's just such a big, imposing guy too. You know what I mean? He's got that presence. He's got the Serb. He looks like, when you you think of like, oh, Serbian war criminal. He kind of looks like that, but in a good way. Not in I don't mean that pejoratively,
Trumpian,
of course. Exactly. But as of course the Navalny fallout, Dmitry, you kind of covered most of it at the beginning. I can say here in Russia, there's no protests. There's no one's really crying in the streets about Navalny right now. But kind of a way to transfer to there from Serbia, we see Dodik going all out, and Vucic, he makes his own little statements. He refused to clap for Navalny's widow, I believe it was, when she came on the stage to address a big group of leaders at one point. And it's Navalny's widow has been doing the whole press tour around everywhere crying about it. And of course now there's these stories about what is going to happen to Navalny's body and the potential funeral. Dmitry, I'm wondering your analysis on what that could lead to.
Yeah, I think it's just worthwhile to mention, kind of looking forward prospectively at what this weird accident, death, or killing could turn into, right? Eventually, and because truly speaking, I've heard very bizarre versions, such as Navalny could have been assassinated by essentially a CIA sleeper, which was planted long before Putin ever came to power. For example, during the Yeltsin years, and then of course transferred prisons and simply taken him out there. Because yes, Putin himself and a lot of Russian senior officials have said that the CIA directly was in power during the Yeltsin years. So there could be very deep sleeper agents within the Russian government. Still, that's not really a fifth column. That's just straight up espionage and essentially covert ops happening on Russian soil, which again, as we've seen with the various Ukrainian terrorist acts, it's very much a possibility here as to who could have potentially killed Navalny in prison if that's what he did, if he was actually killed and not died from natural causes. But his funeral, right, potential black swan, maybe a catalyst for a colored revolution type event. As we've seen, his mother has been openly calling for his body to be revealed to her. She hasn't seen it yet, and she's essentially creating these clips, posting them online of Caucuses on YouTube, claiming that Navalny's body still hasn't been revealed. They are looking into his the cause of death. The autopsy is going to be quite thorough, and in fact they may be retaining the body, looking into it between 14 days to a month, which unfortunately, Conrad, if we look at it, the body may only be released closer towards I mean, it's being kept on ice, literally. Well, they are on the North Pole during winter, so. But the body will be released to his family only maybe closer to the election, which would, again, align if the funeral was allowed to be a public funeral. And I'm assuming it'll be an Orthodox funeral. The funeral may turn into this catalyst for potentially a colored revolution type protest. And we've seen like protests occur domestically and internally in Russian history back in the day. Like this, there's some really clear examples, like the 1905 revolution, which took place in Russia, in Moscow, St. Petersburg. Besides the various Zio-Jewish terrorist acts which took place, there was a lot of Russians who were paid by Western powers and even Japanese spies actually paying for Russian internal protesters to cause uprisings internally in Russia during that 1905 revolution and all those various psyops which were taking place. And of course, 1917, when just before the alleged abdication took place, Petrograd during World War I, there was a lot of German spies doing covert ops. There was all kinds of terrorism. All various acts were being taken place domestically. And here again, it's just very possible, and it's a real scenario. We've seen this in American history too, when there's various hippies began rising up against President Nixon during the Vietnam War, internally calling for the war to end, and essentially ending the Vietnam War somewhat prematurely. I'm not red-pilled on the Vietnam War yet, guys, but I think one day we'll probably discuss it with a proper American historian to kind of break that down. Enormous conflict in American history, but nevertheless, it shows you how an anti-war protest could arise domestically and really change exactly how that war is going. And this Navalny funeral, which will take place in the middle of March, roughly around the time of Putin's election, could be one of these events which unfortunately could destabilize the country internally. Very, very unfortunate that the death of someone who maybe we should all, people should be praying for him, but it'll be used by these necromancers who we mentioned last week, these people who abuse the bodies of the dead. They don't really care about his soul. They don't care about his family. All they care about is utilizing him as a political pawn in order to push their agenda and destabilize Russia further, causing even more deaths of Orthodox Christian people. So that's the end goal, I think, from my perspective. Naturally, I think the liberals are going to applaud and go along with this ridiculous plan of destabilizing a country which is now in a 2-year-long war. So dark times could be coming in the middle of March if their plans succeed.
Yeah, we are recording this on the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of the special military operations. So, happy Z-Day, everybody. But I think you make a really good point about Navalny, especially the fact that, look, people are going to call me a shill for saying that I don't believe that Putin specifically ordered him to be killed. But to me, it just doesn't make sense why they would do that. Navalny is getting more press now, and the regime is getting more criticism than ever with his murder than anything that would have been possible if he was just in prison. Like, I don't understand how this isn't kind of clear to more people. It seems that they realized that Navalny was, kind of wasting away in prison. They'd put so many resources into this guy, kind of building him up as the avatar of a potential color revolution in Russia. And again, here in Moscow, obviously, they're not wearing badges, but I'm sure there are thousands of agents, provocateurs that are ready to enter a crowd and agitate and escalate things if something like that were to happen, like a protest for Navalny or against the war, whatever it may be. And it seems to me that some powers that be ran the numbers and were like, all right, this election's coming up. We may not be able to get him out, but we can at least make it look pretty turbulent if we kill Navalny, have it look like Putin did it, and then kind of enrage everybody leading up to this election in the middle of some pretty dramatic sea changes in the war, of course, with Avdiivka, and then now we're talking about Transnistria and all of the Odessa rhetoric. And of course, you mentioned Lukashenko talking about, the thousands of troops built up on the border of Ukraine, on the border with Ukraine and Belarus. There's talk about that. And of course, the question is Lukashenko bringing up that rhetoric because there might be another strike on Kiev, an attempt on that from Belarus? Of course, Medvedev didn't just say Odessa come home. He also said that, Kiev is a historically Russian city, which that is definitely an escalation. Not that that wasn't already believed. And obviously Putin made that point in the Tucker Carlson interview that, these whole areas are obviously Russian by heritage. It would seem that actually taking Kiev, that's either rhetoric preparing for negotiations or, there is something big in the works, which it could be either one. I don't have any inside information on any, future strikes or anything like that. But, Lukashenko, he's always strategically deployed his rhetoric, and talking about the buildup there, of course, could be preparation for a move. I mean, maybe the Ukrainians are going to move on Belarus. They've done stupider things, not 100%, but it would be near the top of the silliest things, but they have done some other ridiculous things as well. And of course, with Dodik and Lukashenko and Putin, we're building this coalition of these leaders we have. You could put maybe Krasnoselsky in there as well. And, only 2 of those are full state leaders. 2 of those guys are, sub-state leaders. But that's World War now for you, right? Like, this is part of the Third World War, is the redrawing of the map. And it's something that we're always going to focus on here. And it looks like some of those redrawings are, getting closer.
Yeah, I thought the Medvedev interview was quite inspiring. It's maybe, and a lot of people now have become interested in Russian politics and Russian history. So Medvedev kind of continued that note. He's like, okay, well, the Putin Tucker the interview was a hit, and they spoke about a lot of these cities being historically Russian. So I can continue that note and just claim Edessa is a Russian city, which it is. Edessa is historically a Russian imperial city. It was built by the Russian Empire. Was naturally it was completely constructed. Its success, a lot of its buildings, cathedrals, churches are attributed to the I guess just the hard work of honest sort of working Russian Orthodox people who have lived in that city and also in the surrounding oblast and actually having governance and actually contributed to it economically. And the Edessa we see today is not even a Soviet Edessa. This is the Russian Imperial Edessa. The city really hasn't changed that much since those ages long ago. But we should mention that Medvedev, again, he kind of calls out, like the interviewer asks if he remembers the time when he was a liberal, and Medvedev says, I was never a liberal. Those photos you saw with me playing around with an iPhone, or maybe like hiring a Chubais to work on nanotechnology, which was really weird. Again, that was like a waste of funds back in the day. Maybe in 2008, 2009, I think it was like tens of millions, essentially hundreds of millions of dollars were poured into Russian nanotechnology by Chubais, Anatoly Chubais, who then later went to invent the Sputnik vaccine and things like that. But all that money was allegedly wasted. Medvedev was blamed for all this. Medvedev was again blamed for being too much of a liberal in that short 3.5-4 year period. The playing around with iPhones, he was really intrigued by a big Mike, Michelle Obama, by Obama himself, being a black president. Like that was really fancy when Medvedev and Obama would be hanging out. And that was really strange for Russians comparing Medvedev back then to Putin. It was just a complete 180-degree turn. And so Medvedev was like, no, I was just putting on a diplomatic face. I was this hardcore. I was hawkish back then. But it's like, Medvedev, let's just be serious, my friend. Like, you've changed, and you changed for the best, right? A lot of, you're allowed to change. You're allowed to become more conservative as you age. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Medvedev is really, he's just saying, it's not just me typing these weird messages on Telegram. I've actually become more openly hawkish and more conservative. But Medvedev did warn the reporter. He said, there are bigger hawks in the Russian government than me. And so, Russia should be respected, and Ukraine should really consider moving towards some sort of peace deal, which I think we've been talking about for a while now. But yes, this victory in Avdiivka, the realities are that Russia does have the leverage here. The ball is in Russia's court again, and Russia is stretching the Ukrainian army. Ukraine is forcibly conscripting. There is a new law being introduced in Europe as well. Just while all of this is going on in the East, Conrad, there's a new law being introduced in Europe about actually bringing back Ukrainian refugees of fighting age, men specifically, and Ukraine being allowed to bring them back into their country, essentially, which I don't think a law of this sort has ever existed for refugees before in Europe, especially, refugees from African and Middle Eastern countries. They love them, but refugees from Ukraine, no, they have to go back, they have to fight, they have to be conscripted and mobilized, and this is just completely inconsiderate, inhumane, and it just shows that Zelensky is ready to fight till the last Ukrainian, as long as his NATO leaders tell him to do so. And so Medvedev gives a clear signal that Russia's ready for negotiations if the other party comes to the table, but at the moment we're just not seeing that.
Yeah, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, we're going to move on in a second, but we're seeing so many videos of soldiers that have, whether they've deserted, or of course we see the videos of the forced conscription, and then we of course get the propaganda videos from the mercenaries and the people on the front lines begging Congress to approve these billions of dollars for Ukraine that the Senate has approved, but the House is waiting, and it's good, that the House is taking more of an America first position and not writing off billions of dollars to Israel and Ukraine like we've already done. But of course, that is leading to what we're seeing right now, which is, of course, the fall of places like Avdiivka and the retaking of the entire east bank of the Dnieper for the Russians in Kherson region, which is a good thing to see as well. And as we, consider the future of the pushes and the offensives, it's important to also recognize how much of this is, brinksmanship. And as, Brother Nathaniel and others, Metropolitan Theophilos in an interview said as well, we're going to talk about that in a second, that it does seem that Putin wants peace. And while we have made our stance on the show clear that we think a peace will be achieved with more territory gained, it's important to recognize that we're definitely in the stages of, I think, where negotiations, the stage is being set. No side is going to want to, at least on the Ukrainian, the Western side, are going to admit that they're ready to negotiate, but I'm sure behind the scenes, all sorts of plans are being drawn up for how they can take this. So unless you have any other thoughts on that, Dmitry, I think it's time to move on to the Caucasus.
Yeah, I think just two minor points, I suppose, stories that have come out this week. And naturally, on the Russian side of Kherson, so just on the Russian side of the Dnieper River, the Ukrainian forces have been pushed completely back to their side of the Kherson Oblast. So for once, that Krinky area that Ukraine has controlled on the, I guess the Russian side of Kherson, which stressed the Russian forces out so much, and actually they implemented something like martial law. They had curfews in the Kherson Oblast where everybody had to be home by 8 p.m. in the evening, and it just got very intense and stressful towards the latter half of 2023. Suddenly, the Ukrainians have been pushed back. So this success in Avdiivka is not just unique to the Donetsk Oblast and Kherson as well. In Zaporozhye, Russian success is just across the board and very obvious. And this will be used, of course, in any sort of negotiations going forward. The other, I guess, element of negotiations will be the potential economic leverage that Russians have over these strange Polish farmers, right? These Polish tractor drivers who have blockaded the main highway and the freeway leading out of Ukraine to Poland. And it's turned into a 27-kilometer long traffic jam of, there's thousands of trucks waiting to enter Poland from Ukraine, carrying goods, grains, things like that. Essentially very important for Ukraine to actually sell those goods to their European neighbors with very low tariffs and things like that, which the Polish farmers absolutely hate. And about 2,500 trucks from Poland not being able to reach Ukraine. So these Polish farmers, they really don't care about the fact that the Polish government is liberal or anything of that sort. They're driving around with posters like Putin will come and he will restore order here. Like just this really strange messaging, which is very Lukashenko-like. And when you look at these farmers, these are Poles. These are not Russian agents. These are actual Polish people, the patriots, actually rising up and are blockading the roads leading out of Ukraine in order to pressure the Zelensky government. And when Zelensky's, one of the ministers of Ukraine, actually arrives and tries to speak to some of these farmers, like find out who the leader is, they're saying they will not negotiate until the end of March 2024. So until like the 28th of March, there will be no talking to anyone from Ukraine. So Ukraine is really facing a lot of pressure. And again, without this bill, as you said, being even passed through the House, if this bill doesn't pass and if this funding isn't organized, perhaps Ukraine will be pushed towards a potential short-term peace treaty deal with maybe some further considerations being given to Russia. And maybe Russia could then focus on some of the other weird stuff happening, say, on its southern borders, and maybe a bit less on Ukraine, for example, between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yeah, the EU are about to basically reappropriate hundreds of billions of Russia's dollars overseas. So Russia, needs to be taking whatever economic and trade benefits they can around them. But regarding defense and their neighbors, we're going to talk about the Caucasus. And the big news, Nikol Pashinyan has officially pulled Armenia out of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. We had covered in the past how he blew up one of their latest meetings that had to do with the whole region. I remember Lukashenko's face as Pashinyan basically refused to sign like the order kind of every year where they renew the Collective Security Treaty. Lukashenko was like, "What is this retard doing?" Now it seems that he's gone all out and he has left, the Russian version of NATO. He no longer has any kind of Russian security guarantee. And of course, his claim will be that, well, they didn't help us against Nagorno-Karabakh. Well, you didn't even recognize the Republic of Artsakh as a country yourself, Mr. Pashinyan, so expecting Russia to defend it for you based on a treaty that it doesn't cover is a little bit ridiculous. But Pashinyan has also been warning that an Azeri invasion is imminent, that Azerbaijan views Armenia as Western Azerbaijan, and that basically Armenia is at risk of no longer existing. And his brinksmanship is bringing him much closer to France. We've known that Macron has kind of been the main guy bringing Armenia into the Western sphere. And the Armenians recently got a big load of armored trucks and vehicles from France that they're going to be using, while at the same time, though, the Azeris have acquired a much larger purchase of Israeli weapons. And of course, this raises the very interesting questions about the regions and the alliances between said regions, as Turkey has, of course, gone really hard against Israel rhetorically due to, of course, their connection with the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, as well as just an attempt by Erdogan to emerge as a leader in the Islamic world. But that rhetoric kind of wears thin when your number one ally, your effective, satellite country, just over Mount Ararat, is literally taking thousands and thousands and hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons from Israel and giving Israel an insane amount of cheap energy. It seems to run a little thin, Erdogan.
Yeah, there's a very curious connection between, say, the Zionists and the Hasids actually running the show in Kiev with, that weird ecumenical patriarchate not, and of course that ties into Erdogan and his relationship with the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople, now Istanbul. And of course this all ties together with, again, Turkey uniting itself with Azerbaijan, its sort of closest neighbors supporting Israel directly, but Turkey itself holding back, and Erdogan himself, as we've seen throughout this Gaza conflict since the 7th of October, just really strongly rhetorically whipping Israel, but not actually putting anything into action, right? It's all basically hypotheticals, and he's stating that, the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be defended against any sort of Israeli encroachment. And we'll see exactly what will take place, on the 9th of March during Ramadan, when the pressure of the Israelis will mount upon the remaining Palestinians who still visit Jerusalem for any sort of like Islamic or religious festivals and things like that. But yes, you're completely right. Azeri presence and the sort of union with Israel has been a very curious point. We noticed last week how perhaps the Aliyev family clan that runs Azerbaijan, maybe they have some mountain Jewish roots, Gorny Yevrei perhaps, which probably ties them a bit closer to that particular land. It's not just the Israeli-Turkey sort of alliance going on there. Maybe it goes a little bit deeper. But the planes actually carrying the munitions from Baku to the Israeli airbase of Uvda are actually Ilyushin Il-76 transport planes, which are made in Russia. And again, those transport planes are so large. That's the same plane that was carrying the personnel, the prisoners next to Belgorod, which recently was shot down by Ukraine as well. So these really giant, heavy planes are flying nonstop between Israel and Baku, essentially powering up. Again, just as Azerbaijan was assisting Israel several months ago, now it's the opposite. Now Azerbaijan, for some reason, is just retrieving a lot of its support from Israel, which is very interesting. So that we do have that weird Zionist alliance going on there. And again, no real action taken from Turkey. We've seen, when we do speak about the future, the fate of the Middle East and Islamic world, we'll definitely, I think, see Turkey in this weird, maybe third-party-esque position where it's kind of like, well, it just wants to sit back and allow Israel to act with impunity in the Middle East. And it's Azeri neighbors. Well, Armenia won't find any support from Turkey at this point, I think. And what can we say about Macron? Macron is, he does run France like a Freemasonic republic. He's probably a Freemason himself. We haven't seen any lodge records, but he has given presentation at the Grand Orient of the Peoples of France Lodge. And he is quite active in that particular scene. And it's just weird that a Christian country like Armenia would seek support from perhaps the most Masonic country in modern Europe today. It's just very suspicious, and I'm not sure Armenia will actually obtain sovereignty through armaments actually sent to it from this very strange, very forward thinking. I would say forward as in like hellbound liberal country of Europe. I think it's a dead end for Armenia. It's a deal with the devil, and we've spoken about these sort of deals before, the deal that Navalny has taken, and Pashinyan seems to be completely for it because, again, he has left the CSTO, and he's bound himself to this European monster, which will take him to the depths like a giant leviathan.
Yeah, the France, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Israel question, that's a long list of countries I just did there, but it kind of shows some of the things we've discussed on the show about the unfolding alliances in Europe. We've always said that France, maybe Italy, not as much recently since Meloni has screwed everything up, but France has always been one of those countries that was more likely to perhaps reproach with Russia because their right wing has always had a soft spot for Russia. There's always been a relationship between the two. And of course, we know about the history, even before Napoleon, with how influential French culture was, even after as well, on Russia, and how, we even talk about Gabriel de Rochin. I mean, he himself was in France before he went to the Donbass to fight for his country, of course. So there's always that French-Russian connection that, of course, someone like Macron is kind of turning it back to its Napoleonic era as far as Russian relations go and, waging war against them. But the reason that he has gone so hard in support of Armenia is because France views Turkey as their number one Mediterranean enemy, basically. France has all sorts of mineral and resource interests that go against Turkey. Of course, France has a history, not as much as Russia, of course, but it does have a history of going against the Ottoman Empire in certain respects. And France has, of course, we wish they had, done more to help Russia at times, but in general, France has that streak, and it is, more independent than a Germany or an Italy or a Cyprus or a Spain or any of these Scandinavian countries that have NATO American bases and whatnot, whereas France, larger country, larger GDP, many billionaires, they don't have any of that. They have their own navy and army and everything, and they're fairly powerful. Of course, we know that the French army actually was really cleared out at the beginning of the special military operation because multiple officers, like high-ranking ones, were expressing sympathy for Russia and a realistic understanding of the actual conflict. So I don't know how many of those guys have been cleared out, at least a few. So perhaps the French army is not as based as it used to be. But as far as the Turkish, Azerbaijani, Israeli alliance goes, it does really show you how we, despite the fact that it may sound schizophrenic, that we are correct in our analysis and our prediction of the inevitable Russia-Turkey clash. And many have talked about this, of course. Strelkov has talked about this. And with Armenia becoming this new, southern flank, for a possible Western power. It seems that, Turkey and France and Russia, this big shakeup could lead to all sorts of new alliances, whether a new leader comes in and starts reversing what Pashinyan did and goes all out for Russia, or if Armenia becomes actually threatened as a state and then Russia faces pressure to do anything. Of course, I don't know how that pressure will be given now that the CSTO is no longer in effect in Armenia, but it does seem like this is going to be a focal point for that inevitable prophetic clash between, Turkey, Neo-Ottoman, Erdogan's empire, and of course the Third Rome of Russia. And we're always watching for that very closely, of course. And I think I was going to talk about this later, but that's a pretty good, transition into a recent interview of Metropolitan Theophilos on TASS, the Russian news service. And of course, Metropolitan Theophilos, Cypriot Metropolitan, he's one of the main people who speak about St. Paisios prophecies regarding Russia and Turkey. He's predicted things like the war in Ukraine, like the COVID pandemic and whatnot, due to his deep understanding of the prophecies and the patristic witness that he was able to grow up around as a young monastic and as a young clergyman. So I think we're going to talk about that a little bit. It was a really great interview, one of the best that we've really heard recently. And he talks all about the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin, how he listens to it. He talks about how he is praying for the top Russian politicians at the personal request of Svetlana Medvedeva, who is Dmitry Medvedev's wife. And he has some other pretty amazing quotes about, just the current situation in the war and with the gay marriage stuff in Greece, which we're going to get into a bit. But regarding the war in Ukraine, His Eminence said, "The war that is happening now isn't a war with NATO. This is a war against demonic forces and their energy. The Orthodox must understand this. Therefore, they, the representatives of the New World Order, undertook to separate us so that we would quarrel with each other, weaken us. What for? Because only Orthodox service to the Lord gives birth to saints. Demons and the New World Order are afraid of saints." And of course, Metropolitan Neophytos, a strong supporter of Metropolitan Onufri, a strong rejecter of the schismatics in Ukraine, and of course a warner of the future for Cyprus when the Third World War breaks out. While the Turks will move on Greece, there will be a pullout from Cyprus, and he himself is preparing for the day when he can, and he's even doing it now, evangelize to the Turks in the unrecognized northern Cyprus territory. So I think when it comes to talking about the Armenia-Azerbaijan stuff, talking about all of those things, it's really good to listen to the words of a holy hierarch like Metropolitan Theophitos, and he shows that you can really tie all of this stuff together. He, of course, also talked about the legalization of gay marriage in Greece and COVID vaccines and all these other things. And I'll read this last quote from him before hearing your thoughts on it, Dmitry. He says, "Various geophysical cataclysms are coming, which will occur in America, Europe, and Asia, and their consequences will be terribly catastrophic. And at the very end, they will escalate into a world war. When the Israelis strike Iran's nuclear program, countries such as Russia and China will be obliged to respond. The prophecies of the saints say that nuclear weapons will be used. And the most dramatic thing is, that Russia and China don't want this. This is what the New World Order really wants. They push them, put pressure on them to do it, to then say it's their fault. We said that the goal of the New World Order is to reduce the world's population. Therefore, nuclear weapons in world war, like epidemics, are an excuse for them." And at one point he said, "Understand what I said earlier, epidemics, world wars, earthquakes, floods, all those events that will lead a man to kneel and repent before Christ are already knocking on the door." So if you aren't warned before, you've now been warned about, the times and days that we are in. And again, some people say like, this kind of analysis doesn't matter, it all needs to be about the real politique. But just listen to what he said. It is in many ways a real politique perspective, and it shows that our perspective is that the prophecies are just ahead of the curve in this complicated geostrategic world of thousands of different wills converging across national interests, across religious interests, across ethnic interests. These things all combine, and of course the Holy Spirit and God is above all of it. And things work out in the way they work out. It's not to say that things are predetermined, but these prophecies are giving us a glimpse behind the veil into ultimate reality and are able to, in our moment now, give us a glimpse into what is inevitably going to happen, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I thought the interview was quite insightful with the Metropolitan, and the hierarch tells us exactly who are some of the people and some of the families actually behind all of these acts. For example, he mentions George Soros specifically. He says he's involved. He mentions the Rothschilds family, the Jewish banking dynasty, which has run the UK and many other European banks since the 1700s. He mentions the Rockefellers, of course, the American business dynasty, which has betrayed American interests and kind of joined into this New World Order conglomeration. He mentions people like Kissinger, who recently passed away, as like the spiritual father of American diplomacy and international relations, which America really follows through. And it is that realpolitik perspective that America really follows on from. And of course, he says the name itself, Zelensky, the Khazarian, a representative of the New World Order. And Metropolitan Theophilos has called him a Khazarian in the past, but here he is not afraid of actually naming all of these people responsible. And the hierarch knows what he's speaking about, so he doesn't just name these particular people. They're responsible for various acts and objectives that the New World Order sets out across the world, whether it be in Europe, in the Americas, and Ukraine. And he also mentions the names of the two, I want to say heresiarchs, but they're mainly, architects of schism in the Ukraine itself. So alleged Metropolitan Dumenko, Sergei, and false Patriarch of Kiev, Filaret, as well. These two names are called out by him, and he, of course, names them specifically as those in charge of the current calamities taking place. And me and Conrad mentioned, even, I believe it was in the first or second episode of our show, that a lot of these calamities taking place in the real world, which are based on realpolitik laws and things like that, where it's essentially realist politics do rule over international relations and diplomacy, they're all all of these events are underlined by the spiritual well-being and the spiritual health of your particular society and country. So what we're seeing in Greece today is definitely an example, and Metropolitan Neophytos does mention how Greece essentially is fallen, and it's essentially asking for certain really bad events to take place. His words about Greece right now are not good, and they're not positive ones. And we did speak to we spoke about this last week, that if Greece doesn't react to what the lawlessness taking place on its soil, the outcomes will be quite negative. And the Metropolitan warns all of his Greek, I guess his Greek people, like these are his people. He speaks about the Slavics people, the Russian people, and of course the Greek people as a nation are facing enormous challenges going forward. Not just spiritual challenges, but physical ones too, because God will begin testing them and actually separating the wheat from the chaff. And I think we'll be seeing some of that in the near future based on this interview. So as sobering as it was, and as positive, because hey, Metropolitan Neophytos, in fact, he was the inspiration for the show, as you've told us, Conrad, in the first place. A lot of his messages were quite strongly put. I think they were quite horrific, especially, a lot of them were very, very big warning signs to the world. And if more hierarchs spoke just like he did here, I think the world would be definitely in a different situation. A lot of Orthodox nations would perhaps sober up and awaken a lot sooner, but we don't have that many metropolitans like him. So here we are today, of course, suffering under lukewarmness and naturally being led by people who really don't understand that the time of great calamity and tests is really here. I think that peaceful era of the 21st century, where it was just about going to the movies, watching Lord of the Rings, watching like weird stuff like Pirates of the Caribbean, watching the economy get up, getting mobile phones, browsing the internet, playing video games, all this bizarre stuff that people were doing, including monastics, people like Andrei Kuraev, watching YouTube, all this weird stuff. That age is ending. That weird period of peace that we had in the early 2000s was essentially a test. Like, how will we use that peace, and how will we utilize it? Will we build more cathedrals, churches? Will we bring a lot more converts, and will we actually provide missionary work to the people outside of the church? And I don't think the fruits were there. And so we're standing at the precipice of some really major events, which he speaks about in this interview. It's quite scary, in my opinion.
Yeah, we'll probably link the interview below. If not, find us on the socials and we'll have posted it. Briefly before we move on to Iran and stuff, he said that the ban on flights between Russia and Cyprus was introduced by Western elites, and their master is Satan, who doesn't want ties between people and doesn't want pilgrimages and opposes the Holy Orthodox liturgy. I can just relate to that because I've been to Russia coming twice now. I've had to fly through Istanbul every single time, which is annoying. It'd be a lot more convenient if I could just fly from DC or Houston or somewhere and make it on over here. But of course, the Satanists don't want Orthodox people to travel between Orthodox countries and have that kind of brotherhood, of course. But Metropolitan Neophytos mentioned Israel striking Iran's nuclear capability, and that is a really big deal right now, because part of this whole October 7th issue, and many say this was why it was allowed to happen as a possible false flag to begin with, was to get the U.S. to strike the nuclear program on behalf of Israel. And of course, we know Israel itself has an illegal nuclear arsenal that they've pledged to use on the entire world if their state ever, comes under threat. Part of the reason why I'm skeptical of the nuke idea, that we can even create a nuclear holocaust and somehow radiate the earth into anti-life. I'm not sure if that's even possible for man to do something like that. As not that God wouldn't allow terrible things to happen, I just don't think we actually have that quote-unquote God-like capability. But right now, the only real Iranian The only real issues Iran is bringing to the international community is its support for the Houthis, who are going all out. Of course, they recently sunk another ship after having sunk their first one, their first full big ship that they struck and then sunk into the sea last week. It seems that they are getting more precise. They are kind of finding the loopholes and the weaknesses in some of these American ships and their defense systems. Of course, we said that one of the American ships had to use its like immediate defense systems against one of these missiles because it got so close, which shows you the progress that the Houthis are making. But it does also point out how little the rest of the Muslim world is doing when you look at how hard the Houthis are going as literal sub-state actors and facing huge American strikes.
Yeah, the Houthis have, shown us further success in what can only be described as the U.S.'s most stressful naval battle since fighting against the Japanese in World War II, as described by certain American commentators, which is a little bit shameful because again, the Houthis simply don't have any naval vessels of their own. It's a sea and sort of ground type battle. But the Houthis have fired at a British commercial ship, which they've accused of having Israeli ties. It's the Ruby Myrrh, which we're speaking about here. And at first, the first reports from the Houthis were that the entire ship is sunk. And the liberal West has reacted by claiming that this is a huge environmental threat to both the fish in the Red Sea as well as global warming, things like that. Turns out the ship actually wasn't sunk; it was completely disabled by Houthi missiles, and it was then dragged to that one place we spoke about, Djibouti, that international mega corporation port controlled by several countries at once, kind of preventing Ethiopia's rise. So very interesting how that Ruby Myrrh is now being towed as we speak. Actually, it's completely severed from any ability to actually take itself through the Suez Canal, and it's just an interesting kind of link between again the Houthis and the Ethiopians, who are still vying for some sort of freedom from those countries oppressing them. It's just a very interesting connection there. But the Houthis, yes, successful in sort of baiting, I guess, the attention of the US, and Germany has announced that it will be also introducing battalions of naval forces, which now we understand Germany has a navy. They'll be sending down ships to actually contribute to Operation Prosperity Guardian, and this is the first operation which Germany has contributed to since the Iraq War. So now Germany is being involved. The US, of course, has steadily begun toning down its rhetoric towards the Houthis because they've understood that this looks essentially like a second Afghanistan, and the Houthis themselves on the ground are very much like a Taliban 2.0 type people who will simply not surrender, as they've shown against their war freedom against the Saudis. And going forward, these bombardments are now taking place a little bit less frequently, maybe twice a week. The U.S. Ships are firing on Houthi villages and actually trying to, they're spending $600,000 missiles, right, to take out a village, which its average GDP is maybe, I don't know, a couple of $1,000s at most. So essentially, it's not really a fair battle for the U.S. forces, and it's essentially wasting U.S. taxpayer money on destroying innocent civilians and their livelihoods in Yemen. It's really not contributing to anything, and that's why in the media I've noticed, the BBC, Washington Post, they've actually stopped reporting on the Houthi situation. In fact, it's almost not being shown at all. It just shows kind of the US's failure to shine a sort of positive light on this particular event, which is taking place in the southern Red Sea.
Well, there's rumors of an Iranian spy ship. They're supposedly in the Red Sea. The question is it helping the Houthis? Is that why they've been able to strike so precisely? Is that why they've gotten so close to American vessels? We don't really know, but there have been calls from some of these admirals that have, like you said that this is the most intense naval battle since the beginning of World War II. They've called to sink that Iranian ship. So if something like that happens, that would be an extremely dramatic escalation. And of course, speaking of dramatic escalations, we see the Israelis about to do another one as Itamar Ben-Gvir, kind of the ultra-Zionist, Kahanist at the highest post in the Israeli security state and the National Security Council. He is calling on basically the exclusion of all Arabs from the Al-Aqsa Mosque in general, and basically just going all out on the initial issue that started October 7th and started this whole war to begin with, which was that rabbinical storming and ritualization of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque itself. So Ben-Gvir seems to... We thought that Netanyahu wanted October 7th to happen. Maybe this entire thing has been the Kahanists just making something happen so they can make Greater Israel real faster and faster. Maybe it's because they see people like Candace Owens and others, and people like Brother Nathaniel and Nick Fuentes, blowing up and just naming them. But, that could be why they have this imperative for Greater Israel right now. But I think in general, if something like that Iranian ship in the Red Sea gets sunk, or if there's another big escalation on Al-Aqsa, or like Netanyahu is now talking about, the purpose of the Rafah operation is no longer exactly to expel everybody into Sinai, at least not openly. They probably will still end up trying to do that. The goal now is, total demilitarization, the abolition of the UNRWA, which is the United Nations kind of mission in Gaza and Palestine. They, of course, accuse them of working with Hamas. But it seems that if one of these dramatic things happen, Iran may be willing to tell Hezbollah that they need to step things up. Because like we said, right now, the Houthis are the only ones doing anything. The only thing that can be said for Saudi Arabia and these other countries is they are using their diplomatic leverage over the United States to push for the two-state solution. And that has been one of the more dramatic shifts. It seems that Biden and a lot of these Western countries are now fully in favor of a two-state solution, which is totally unacceptable to the Israelis and the Zionists. So it'll lead to some interesting disputes and relationship changes, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think the one, I guess, very, very important for the Muslim world relationship, which hasn't been mentioned much by the mainstream media, is that relationship between the King of Jordan, Abdullah II, the defender of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Palestinian people, because his wife being Palestinian herself, he of course has really strong interest to having actually Ramadan take place in a peaceful environment. And of course, as you mentioned, the Minister of Defense of Israel giving such strong anti-Palestinian, anti-Islamic rhetoric as Ramadan approaches on the 9th of March, claiming that, and this is quoting him, he says, entry restrictions to the Temple Mount are imposed on Arabs from Judea and Samaria. So this is Israel calls the West Bank Judea and Samaria, again, bringing up these Old Testament names, essentially supplanting them. And he states, only individuals over 60 years old, children under 10 years old, and no more than 15,000 people will be allowed onto the Temple Mount. So these really harsh restrictions onto these, fairly peaceful and harmless religious practices of the local Muslim people from the West Bank, which the West Bank is, again, not involved with Hamas, not involved with Hezbollah. They have their own thing going on with their own Palestinian Authority government. And in fact, they're directly adjacent to the people of Jordan. And naturally, the question will be, will Abdullah II of Jordan, the king, will he somehow react to this, react to the rights of Muslims being tarnished and affected negatively by these Israeli supremacists? And at this point, we can say very clearly, it's not just the secular Jews who are bullying the Muslims. It's these rabbinical, very sort of believing, as you said, like it's more like a ritual humiliation of the local Muslims, which will be taking place on this, on this Temple Mount. And frankly, I think us Orthodox Christians were probably next on the line, especially considering that Great Lent begins on the 18th of March and Easter is on the 4th and 5th. How will they allow us to worship in Jerusalem this year? We know of the Holy Fire. We recall all of those really deep and negative COVID restrictions which took place in Israel when they didn't allow naturally any tourists or pilgrims, and they had to force all the priests and monks to wear masks, things like that. But how will that go forward? What will they do to us after they take care of their Muslim neighbors, right? So really deep questions, and hopefully the King of Jordan actually steps up just like his Houthi Islamic brothers in the south and perhaps defends the righteous cause of the people of Palestine, and not just Hamas, right, but the actual peaceful people protesting for some sort of rights in the only country that they have, in fact.
Yeah, of course, the millions sheltering in Rafah they're still undergoing, bombardment and whatnot. And of course, the ceasefire has been called for. That was one of the biggest shifts. It seems that the U.S. is supporting some variation of one of these UN ceasefire resolutions, which apparently that's just anti-Semitic. So I guess every country in the world is anti-Semitic now, according to Israel. But you talked about some miracles and whatnot. We're going to talk about some of those Myrrh streaming icons here before the end of the show. But unless you have anything else you want to say on the Israel conflict, we could probably move on to Greece. Because, of course, last week I went off about this. People were like, man, you got so heated in the last episode. It was because, someone's got to do it, because apparently the Greeks are not doing it enough. Of course, the white pill is we saw Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus excommunicate every member of parliament that voted for this. So in that region of the Athens area of Piraeus, which is a very populated, large, relevant region in Greece and the Athens metropolitan area and the Orthodox world, none of those MPs will be taking communion there. Of course, I'm sure there's some bishops that they can scurry off to and find communion, but I hope that more bishops follow Metropolitan Seraphim here and go along and do this. Of course, we heard Metropolitan Theophilos' words, and he said it. I mean, I think Greece is in for some pretty large earthquakes, maybe some resurrected volcanoes, and some other craziness if they don't start really making up for this.
Yeah, very well put. I think Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus, who we spoke about on our really in-depth interview about bishops who have made really the correct rhetorical choices over the last few years, for our episode regarding bishops, I think it's worth checking out because we mentioned both Metropolitan Seraphim, of course, Metropolitan Neophytos there, and many others, Russians, Greeks, American bishops alike, Canadian bishops. It's really definitely worth checking that particular episode out. But Metropolitan Seraphim, he's been criticized by the Greeks, by the Greek liberals, as being this radical in the past. And in fact, again, this will probably be a sort of, I guess the liberals will say, "Oh, this is to your detriment. How can you excommunicate them? You're a despot. He is a despot in the best way possible, liturgically speaking. But you're a tyrant." The liberal bishops will probably rise up against him in Greece because, unfortunately, just like in the Russian church and other churches, there are some liberal bishops in Greece. But his excommunication, his anathema of these particular people, it should stand. And in fact, if I was one of those politicians, even lukewarmly who voted yes in this particular election, I would be seeking penance. And I'd be speaking to this Metropolitan specifically because, again, when you walk up to the chalice in church, it's even if you do commune and you are excommunicated, the judgment will fall on you. So it's actually very scary. And in fact, if any clergyman in the Orthodox Church excommunicates you, and only a bishop can really do that, then naturally, I think you should seek some assistance right away. And this is like a good example of that. Frankly, I'm just glad that at least one bishop of the Greek Church had the impetus to actually act out. And yes, very unfortunate that the only protests we see in Greece this week, we did predict perhaps the Greek people would rise up and maybe this bill would be rescinded very quickly. Unfortunately, that did not take place. The only protests we see are related to the economy. Protests, like farmers are protesting in Athens and other towns. Everybody cares about money, even though the country's already sold out and taken, it's completely taken control by the banks. And I understand maybe the farmers do have righteous things to protest about, but we see no protesters against this new gay marriage bill in Greece. And that's the truth of it. If you Google it, nothing really comes up. The Greek Telegram channels are quite silent. So unless there is a complete media blackout, right, Conrad, and this is like really deep conspiracy, unless the media is really not showing us what's happening on the ground in some of these Greek cities, and if Greek monks are just chilling and relaxing and nothing's really taking place, and we know Greece has some of the most monasteries per capita, like literally per kilometer square. If nobody really cares about this bill, perhaps those things that Metropolitan Theophilos spoke about and what Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus warned about, they will come to pass. And yeah, it's just quite a negative sort of story this week, continuing on from the last. But I think positively speaking, when we do get to the Ukraine segment, there's been some great miracles actually taking place in the north, which shows that God's grace is still on his people, regardless of which land they're from and what's taking place around them. And I think the best story here is.
So yeah, regarding that, before we move on, I want to say there was a priest, Father Vasilios Volodakis, who he's told a story, and this was only in January. He talked about how he had a conversation with a parishioner who I guess was a homosexual, and that parishioner told him straight out that there were 175 members of parliament that are going to vote to legalize gay marriage, and that's almost exactly what happened. And then suspiciously, Father Vasilios, he ended up passing away on February 19th, so people are wondering if something bad happened to him and he was maybe taken out. But besides Metropolitan Neophytos, even priests and people that have, been working hard behind the scenes to be, Father Vasilios was also very anti-vaccine and these other things. It seems that the powers that be in Greece are a bit frightened of some of these figures and what they're doing. But I think we'd rather talk about a few more encouraging stories right now and some miracles happening in Russia, Dmitry.
Yeah, absolutely. That Masonic threat is always present, whether you're in Europe or in Russia. But in Russia at the moment, some great things are taking place. So the Trinity Sergius Lavra, there's a massive icon standing there of St. Sergius right next to his relics. And this is the most important monastery, the largest and historically most relevant monastery, just 150 kilometers north of Moscow. The icon of St. Sergius began streaming Myrrh just after the fall of Avdiivka, and very heavily so, to the point where the camera, moves up all the way to the glass and you can see just droplets of Myrrh everywhere. It's just really quite stark. And usually that icon, it's one of those icons which isn't really an impressive work of art or anything, so it's quite striking to actually see it stream Myrrh. Like obviously the Rublev Trinity looks a lot more appealing, which used to stand right next to it. And in fact, so that entire cathedral is definitely full of holiness and God's grace, which is really encouraging that, such miracles still occur, considering that Russia is engaged in this essentially really striking, powerful war with the Western forces. I mean, it just completely underlines essentially everything Metropolitan Theophilos has said about the forces of evil rising up against Russia and Orthodox nations. We see a very similar miracle occur right next to Avdiivka in the Donetsk People's Republic. Father Dmitry Vasilenkov states that he was having a procession as Avdiivka was being sieged by the Russian forces around a monastery near Donetsk, and he was leading the procession. But somebody in the procession was carrying a small icon of Saint George, the great martyr, so Saint George the victory bearer who slew the dragon. This icon, in fact, was not the typical icon of Saint George where he's mounted on a horse slaying the dragon with a spear, but in fact it was just like a small torso head icon of the saint, which are very common in Greece as well. So just the head of the saint is present, the icon is holding it in his hands, and suddenly the icon began streaming myrrh during the procession. And not just myrrh, but the entire procession began to smell this very powerful, like a perfume or an incense, just a grace-filled aura started filling the entire vicinity. And this is outside as well. This is February, so it's quite cold. It's somewhat windy in that area. Still, just an amazing kind of story that speaks to the fact that the Lord is still present despite all these really negative events happening around the world. And, just a really uplifting. And, this all comes to light. Again, these great things are happening on the Russian side of the border. Meanwhile, how are the Ukrainians reflecting this, or, any sort of miracles? Are we seeing anything of the same? No, in fact, we're seeing the persecution of the church further. In, one of the Hasidic capitals of Ukraine, the city of Dnipropetrovsk, a priest, Father Alexei, was in prison for 5 years. The court has officially sentenced him, so he'll be probably heading off to some prison in Western Ukraine, essentially a confessor of the faith at this point. And he was imprisoned for only believing in, he was pro-Russian and he was posting some pro-Russian things online. And in fact, that's what he was in prison for spreading allegedly anti-Ukrainian propaganda. So an Orthodox parish has lost a priest today in Ukraine, which is very unfortunate. We need to pray for Father Alexei. In other, I guess, interesting news, we have, again, new confessors, right? New saints, as Metropolitan Theophilos did say, new saints will be rising up. We see this in Ukraine in live as the house of Metropolitan Feodosy of Cherkasy. His house was raided by the SBU. These are the Ukrainian feds, the Ukrainian version of the FBI, CIA, sort of intermixed, because they act both domestically and externally. And this force has raided his house. They've given him a notice that, look, based on your recent videos that you've been releasing on Telegram and YouTube and things like that about the Ukrainian armed forces seizing monasteries, we acknowledge that this is fake news and this is Russian propaganda. And so you are facing potentially, if we take you to court, 8 years of prison. And when the Metropolitan was handed this legal notice, he had a heart attack. And now he's in prison recovering. So Metropolitan Feodosius of Cherkasy, he needs our prayers. He's a person who's been tormented, just like Patriarch Tikhon of Moscow back in the day by the Bolsheviks, and he eventually died from heart complications in his early 60s. But that's what they do when they can't actually take you out physically through assassination, or like Conrad, you mentioned that really powerful priest in Greece, who these priests begin dying mysteriously, or they're bullied, or they're in fact stressed out to the point where they actually, like, ailments begin occurring within them, because again, this is spiritual as well as psychological and physical warfare that they're facing. So, yeah, there are these stories powerfully from the front lines. In fact, they should probably inspire people both in Greece and Russia to actually look forward and ahead, and maybe re-engage more with Christianity in order to lead their societies forward. So we definitely have a variety of news from this week, both positive and negative. But generally speaking, I think what's happening on the front lines, despite the losses in Greece, in Russia, it's looking quite blessed, I think. And these new miracle Myrrh streaming icons are really an inspiration.
When you talk about the success on the front lines, as of recording this, it appears that the Russians have taken over half of Robotine on the Zaporozhye front, and that the Surovikin line and the general front line will be basically leveling out. And that means all of the Ukrainian incursions will have been completely pushed back. We mentioned Kherson earlier, and of course, Avdiivka has been taken. So this is big news, and they are perhaps stabilizing this front line in preparation for something larger, which we can only hope for at that point. But yeah, I mean, this has been an exciting episode. We talk a lot about, it's really, like I said, a good World War Now episode about specific things going on in these wars, about a lot of prophetic words from our hierarchs. And of course, when it comes to the Transnistria thing, that's just right up our alley. But before we wrap up, we have to talk about this one other story. Well, there was the big AT&T outage in America, which everyone accused of being a Russian cyber attack. I don't know if there's been any evidence of that. We have been covering, Russia has been, inflicting some pretty big cyber pain on Poland and even Eastern Germany with some of their, I think, cyber tests that they've been doing, taking out internet, taking out other sorts of things. But we have seen the sort of predictive programming with, the Russian space EMP, the space nukes. We hear that China is working towards those capabilities as well here in America. But I actually didn't really experience much of an outage, despite being an AT&T customer. I was in DC at the time when that all happened. So it could just be maybe it was a false flag to prepare people for the idea of a Russian or Iranian cyber attack, because we know the Iranians are also very advanced in cyber warfare. But with that small story aside, the last interesting story we wanted to talk about here is that the United Arab Emirates is buying an entire city from Egypt. That's right, they're buying the town of Ras Al Hekma, northwestern coast of Egypt on the Mediterranean Sea, for $35 billion. And that's to be $15 billion in advance. And then over 2 months, the other $20 billion would come in. And this is obviously one of the largest foreign direct investments that's ever really happened. Obviously, with Egypt and the UAE, it's the largest. And I guess the UAE are trying to turn this into some mega tourist port commerce city on the Mediterranean. And the Egyptians have said that this injection of liquidity will help their current economic crisis. And Egypt is, they're in hot water in a lot of ways. Of course, they've got the Rafah crossing in Gaza and the duty that they have there. They have their crisis with Ethiopia and their water crisis, how the Nile is drying up as Ethiopia prepares to complete the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which, if they decided to fill the reservoir at the pace they want to, it would basically destroy Egypt's, water capabilities. And they're now selling, cities off to the UAE. I can't imagine other countries, people would be happy with their leadership selling off their land and cities to other countries, because it's said that the people that live there are going to have to, they're going to be compensated eminent domain type stuff. I mean, what if you don't want to leave? That's kind of an interesting question. So it's an interesting development. And I think this is kind of one of the nodes that shows kind of the future we're going into. We have these big powers, these big oil money barons in the Gulf and these places, and they have this crazy liquidity. They're these monarchs with their corporate supporters that they can just go around and do all of these crazy things. We've seen Dubai and these other places become these, these kind of party, ultra-rich meccas with all of the energy money coming into these places. And as, certain powers and people and leaders, consolidate power, become more monarchical, as we think things are moving towards, the age of Caesars, we're going to see more unilateral decisions like this with interesting political and geographical, I guess, developments in the world that wouldn't really have been thinkable in the 20th and early 21st centuries. But people are thinking outside the box. Multipolarity is rising, and things like this can happen. Maybe we're going to see city-states become a thing again. I guess in a way, the Emirates and these other places are somewhat city-states. But as those places become more relevant and multipolarity rises, I think we may see a return to a more diversified form of statecraft around the world.
Yeah, I think that's very important notes to end on, and especially since we're looking at the world now. There's a lot of blood money going around. There's money from different oligarch circles. There's essentially at this point there's money from royalty going towards buying more commercial, property which will be commercialized. And the Egyptians, again, they don't have a really choice. They have to probably sell this land off in order to fund the new refugee camps that they're building in the Sinai Peninsula. It's all tied, like money is very much tied to the lives of people, and of course the price of blood is being discussed here at this point. The blood of these Muslim and Christian Palestinians, which is being spilt in the Levant. I think it's a big consideration. Notice how the UAE is really not supporting any of these Palestinians, only rhetorically, right? But again, the money is being spent to actually build up more of their commercial strength abroad, and Egypt just has to take that money because it needs to support the future Palestinians, which will be naturally, most likely, in the next few weeks, pushed out of Rafah and out of Gaza, and the cultural genocide which will be committed upon them will leave Egypt with no choice but to take them in as refugees. So it's very unfortunate, and I think it just pushes us towards this future which will look quite dystopian, I would say, especially with all the various technological developments taking place, but as well as the price of human life is definitely going down. Simply, just as Metropolitan Theophilos said, these people don't care about the 8 billion population. They need the world to have 500 million people at most. That's what the globalists care about. The price of human life is very cheap. They care more about land, commercial success, and money.
That's very true. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Of course, tune in next week. We're going to be talking about the South Carolina primary. Trump is about to trounce Nikki Haley in her own home state there, so stay tuned for that. We're going to be keeping a close eye on this Transnistria question. Follow us on all the socials, obviously, to see what happens with that Congress, the 28th and the 29th. We're waiting for that. Obviously, we're watching the Houthis and everything they're doing. We're watching the Temple Mount with what these Kahanist Zionist crazy people may or may not be thinking. And obviously, we're watching Armenia, Azerbaijan as well as, potential invasion and a continuation of the Artsakh war, goes into Armenia proper. That would be a dramatic escalation and a big move in the Turkish world, which pushes us towards that war moment where they move on Greece and then Russia does its thing, that St. Paisios moment. So we're here watching it. Obviously, follow us, worldwarnow.co. That's worldwarnow.substack.com. Both links work. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, worldwarnow_. Follow us on Telegram, worldwarnow_telly. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. I'm going to be posting more here in Russia, here on my second trip. Follow Dmitry at OCanonist. Be sure to follow us on YouTube, World War Now. Subscribe. It really helps us out. Like the videos, leave comments. That also helps. Follow us on Rumble. We've got some backups there. It'll always be a good backup to have. And be sure to get behind the paywall if you want to support the show and hear every episode of Ether Hour. We're going to have that Q&A thread up. So get behind the paywall and you can ask a question in that thread that should be up as you're listening to this. So be sure to do that. And all you people that already support, thank you so much. Apologies for no Ether Hour this week. I hope you can forgive me as I'm traveling and doing some pretty cool stuff. So with all of that, thanks so much for listening. Dmitry, I'll let you send it off briefly.
Thank you guys for your support. We're always looking for more feedback, and we appreciate the information, the links you've been sending us. A lot of people actually sharing these big interviews with hierarchs of the church, some of the news. Naturally, feel free to send us in any information that you think we should cover on the show in the coming week, and we appreciate all your help. We look forward to hearing more about your trip, Conrad, as you tell us about the Third Rome and what's taking place there. So thank you, guys.
God bless y'all.